Hello, hello. I'll give everyone a moment to connect to sound here. Hello and welcome to the Brooklyn Rail's 1328th New Social Environment. I'm Joshua, a programs associate here at the Rail, and I have the pleasure and privilege of being your MC today for a conversation featuring Naeem Mohaiemen and Tausif Noor. And now I'll introduce today's guest and host. Naeem Mohaiemen combines films, photography, and essays to explore forms of utopia-dystopia within families, borders, architecture, and uprisings, beginning from South Asia and then radiating outward to transnational collisions in the Islamicate world after 1945. Mohaiemen is co-editor with Eszter Szakacs of Solidarity Must Be Defended and author of Bengal Photography's Reality Quest, Midnight's Third Child, and Prisoners of Shothik Itihash. Mohaiemen is Director of Undergraduate Studies in the Visual Arts Department at Columbia University in New York. Our host today, Tausif Noor, is a critic, curator, and PhD student in modern art history at the University of California, Berkeley. His criticism and essays have appeared in Art Forum, The New York Times, The New Yorker, and the New York Review of Books, among other venues, as well as in various artist catalogs and monographs. He is a recipient of a 2023 Grace Dudley Prize for Arts Writing from the Robert B. Silvers Foundation, as well as a 2023 Andy Warhol Foundation Creative Capital Arts Writers Grant for short form writing. And with that, I'll go ahead and pass it over to Naeem here while I pull up these videos.
Thank you, Joshua, for the introduction, Brooklyn Rail for having us, Osif for agreeing to be in the role of interlocutor. Just to introduce the clips that Joshua is going to show very quickly, there are two short excerpts from the film Through a Mirror Darkly, which is currently on view at the WEX at Ohio State University. And before that had a London premiere at Art Angel. These two clips, they kind of land us as the audience directly into two of the key moments in this film about the memorialization, not just of the Vietnam War, but memorialization of the protests against the Vietnam War on US campuses. In the first clip, Joshua, if I have the sequence correct, we'll actually see a student at Kent State whose job is to clean the official markers. That's his work study, literally. And then the second one, you'll actually see one of the people who had to evacuate Vietnam after the fall of Saigon because they were, quote unquote, on the wrong side in that conflict in that moment. So with that, I'll turn it over to Joshua.
Give me one moment here. I'm going to grab these videos.
We're now approaching the fence where behind lie all the blacks. As we leave the whites, the pavement ends and gravel starts.
She cared about people. She didn't like war. And I guess she cussed. Is that a reason for killing her? Some people think it is.
This is the grave where my brother is lying. I received a phone call one Friday morning about 4 o'clock saying that my brother had been shot at Jackson State College.
I'm having a little bit of trouble with the second clip here. Did we want to just hop into the conversation and then I can work on getting this figured out?
Sure. That
Sure.
sounds great. Yeah. Thank you, everyone, for being here. Thank you to the Rail, and thank you so much, Naeem, for giving us an opportunity to really think about and think through the valences of your work. So at the center of your exhibition, Corinthians, which is on view at the Wexner through May 24th, is a three-channel film called Through a Mirror Darkly. And for those of us who are not as biblically versed, the title is Through a Mirror Darkly refers to a passage from the Bible, Corinthians 13:12. For now we see through a mirror darkly, but then face to face. And I think it's significant because so much of your work is about threading together, and maybe not threading together, but at least juxtaposing and placing next to each other moments, perhaps moments that are unexpected throughout history. So the three-channel film Through a Mirror Darkly, it explores three kind of moments of crisis in the 1970s. So you have the Kent state shootings in Ohio on May 4th, and then just 10 days later, the shootings at Jackson State College, it's now university. And the sort of difference between the two. And in the first clip that we just saw, we see this juxtaposition at work. So the center screen is contemporary footage that Naeem has shot, and then it's bracketed in a way by archival footage on either side. And what's so significant about the clip that we just saw is we see that difference in memorialization of the Black students who were shot at Jackson State versus all of the sort of media coverage of Kent State. Of course, these are examples of state repression against student activism, anti-war activism specifically. The entire kind of film is sort of covered by the period of the Vietnam War. But of course, there's also the simultaneity of anti-Black violence. And it's on the heels of the global 68 protests, and of course, the civil rights protests. So I guess one of the things that I want to highlight in your work in general, but in this work specifically, is that you bring together different archival moments with the contemporary. And you do this in a way such that there's something revealed or something that is perhaps a little bit buried that comes to light about what in history really comes to the surface, what in history really gets noticed and historicized. So much of your work, I think, is also about that process of historicization. And in this work particularly, you use memorials in the process of memorialization to discuss this kind of process of historicization, of grieving. Maybe we can just start with the genesis of the work. I know that the kind of kernels of this idea started way back in around 2021, 2022. So if you could just talk about how you came to make this work and how it came to be exhibited at the Wexner.
Thank you, Tausif. The genesis actually even earlier than that. 2021 might be when there was a formal organization involved, Art Angel first, then the Wex, and then Film Video Umbrella in England. But actually the genesis is much earlier. I went to, the first place I arrived in the US as an international student was Oberlin College in Ohio. Back in the 90s, they still had scholarships for international students, which is literally the reason I arrived there on a campus I had never heard of. And of course, Oberlin's an hour away from Kent State. So within that campus's imagination of political protest, which reached a peak actually during the first Gulf War, which happened while we were sophomores, and which was a profoundly confusing moment actually, because the first Gulf War started, anti-war protests started. The anti-war protests very explicitly invoked Vietnam, of course, both because that's one of the obvious analogs and also because you're in Ohio, so you invoke Kent State. And then to everybody's surprise, or it was quite unexpected that the Gulf War was over so quickly, right? Certainly the quote-unquote liberators did not get greeted with flower petals as George Bush had predicted, but the war was over. So an anti-war movement loses its way when a war ends unexpectedly quickly. And so it was a moment of sort of reckoning of what do we stand for if we start organizing against a war and the war ends. And so Kent State would keep coming up, what Kent State meant, how the Vietnam War was different, why it was different. Obviously, one big thing is that during Vietnam, this is quite singularly important to understand, there was a draft. So an American student or any American citizen or any inhabitant of the United States who's protesting may also be protesting for their right to not be sent overseas. That was part of the discourse. That already wasn't part of the discourse during the first Gulf War because, of course, after Vietnam is what kills the draft. After Vietnam, no American government wants to risk the draft anymore. So it becomes an all-volunteer army. So that's the water within which we're swimming as college undergraduates, figuring out our politics, trying to be larger than our campus, trying to be larger than Ohio, trying to be part of a global discourse, yet also in Ohio, in a sleepy town, your reach of major cities, even Cleveland is not near, trying to navigate that. And throughout all this, all I ever heard about, all that was invoked was Kent State. Jackson State was never mentioned. It's quite extraordinary. This is a liberal campus. It's a self-styled progressive campus. One of the first protests on campus was against structural racism, and yet Jackson State wouldn't come up. And it's the erasure by omission or the erasure by forgetting. And of course, as you'll see when you see the film, Jackson State was also a complicated campus and event to string on the same timeline, because the protests at Jackson State were not just about the Vietnam War. They were also about, as you said, anti-Black racism. So there could even have been a way that liberal opinion might have thought, well, that's about anti-Black racism, which isn't on the same continuum as protesting in Vietnam. Although, of course, Muhammad Ali would make the point, or did make the point, that it was the same. So it stuck in my head for many years, even decades, that why didn't I hear about Jackson State? Even in my progressive circles. And it kept bubbling. I proposed it to the Cleveland Triennial twice. The Cleveland Triennial ran for 2 editions and then folded, but I proposed it to both editions. And both times it was, declined in the way sometimes things are declined. You don't get a yes or a no, you just get, the thing just fizzles out. And at some point somebody said to me, killing of students at Kent State is not what a triennial, it was a triennial, not a biennial, wants when they're also trying to have the art exhibition as a model for urban renewal, right? Bringing investment in. You're trying to bring investment into Cleveland, trying to present Ohio as a cultural hub. You're not necessarily wanting to talk about the killings of students. So that also stuck in my head and, kind of really troubled me that here was this project that I couldn't get supported. Yet I knew that if I had gone to the same funding body and said, I want to make something about climate change in South Asia, it would be like, that's the work you're expected to make. And that's the work that will also advance the conversation. We know that there's a way that certain discourses are very important, but also don't make people nervous because it fits within certain purposes. So it was stuck in my head for a long time as a thing that, why can't I make it? Why isn't anyone interested? And the more you sit with something, the more you get troubled by it. And so that's how it started. And the very significant thing is, of course, it started before 2023. So it started before this current round of repression on campus. So I don't know what I would have done if that had already started, because I don't know, maybe I would have become stuck as the contemporary is so overwhelming and so immediate that how can you go back and look at the past? But I had already started. I was already in the post-production stage, or one part of the post-production stage. So one thing I did do is I didn't change it dramatically, although of course the last 2 years were very heavily on my mind, and I would say on the minds of audiences as they watch it.
Right. I want to pick up on something that you just said about the overwhelmingness of the contemporary and how it relates to the past. And the way that I'll sort of segue into that is by thinking about juxtaposition and parallelism. So this is a 3-channel film. We have the central projection with contemporaneous footage that you shot. On either side, you have these Super 8 films, 16 millimeter films that have been projected. So here, past and present are brought together on the same plane. Now, I want to kind of think about first that process of gathering that archival material. So at the end of the film in the credits, you list quite a number of different archives, researchers who have assisted you, but in sort of excavating that, was that process simultaneous with the shooting of the new footage? And then how did you actually think about what gets put together and juxtaposed and made parallel? I'm really interested in that process because the archive, we think of it as the static thing, but we know it's continually growing. Sometimes there are so many gaps, and those gaps and things can inform us. And you just mentioned the difference in media coverage of Jackson State versus Kent State. Why is one so ensconced in history and the other not? But in the process of, gathering together this archival material, how did you think about actually filming the new footage?
So there's a few things to say. One is I will say that, of course, the Kent State archives are easier to find, right? The Kent State events are well documented enough that the archives are actually split between two major university collections. A very large collection at Kent State University, as you would expect, and then a second very large collection at Yale University. And what was explained to me, I don't know if this is urban legend because I didn't find any documentation, but that the reason a large portion of it ends up at Yale is because among alumni of Kent State, there was distrust of the university, such that some people felt, no, I'm not going to give my archive of my time at Kent State and these events to Kent State. I'm not really sure why Yale emerged as the alternative, except perhaps maybe the Yale archive was more organized in terms of collecting, or it could be as simple as somebody knew somebody who said, why don't you give it to Yale? And that's how it ends up at Yale. The Yale archive is also a quite fascinating event, like the FBI, FOIA request results, most of which are blacked out. So you get like a storm of actually black because the FBI reveals hardly anything. But yet they are turned over the papers. That most of that is at Yale. There are some other strange elements that are in there where you're like, oh, why is this in here? Some staged plays that people were doing, unclear. So it's a lot of material, right? I mean, there was a point when I was looking through all these simulations of Kent State done by theater students. Not great acting and no props, and you are looking at it and you're thinking, speaking of tone, oh, if I show this or if I include this, am I being ironic because the acting is so bad, or am I just presenting students working through it in the way they can? And irony is a very complicated thing to work with in these situations, especially when the witnesses and protagonists are living and may very well come and see your film. You have to think through what irony does for them. How does it work or not work? So those things were also in my head. So Kent State is this quite vast archive, right? Two universities, and also, of course, in the commercial archives like ABC, NBC, CBS, any of these places that license footage, they just have volumes of this material. Sometimes Ken Burns has already gone through this material to make his film, his series for PBS, etc. And then Jackson State, there's hardly anything. There is certainly not anything of the event itself. If you get to the Jackson State chapter, which Tausif and Joshua, I know you've seen it, you'll actually notice right away that, first of all, the footage is much more buzzy, right? There's that static in the background. It's been transferred from a VHS or some other tape, and it's not a good transfer, so there's that hum continuous. It's news reports, black and white, which is also an aspect of, for example, the Vanderbilt archives, which kept an archive of television, but it's always in black and white. And it's after the fact. The next day, reporters have shown up, they're standing in front of the building, but there's no footage of the actual event. And in Kent State, of course, famously, there is actual footage, right? Now, that's also a position of some level of middle-class access to having a camera so as to be shooting. So you notice that right away, the paucity of the Jackson State Archive and the abundance of the Kent State Archive immediately already creates a visual representation of, with Jackson State, it was use every piece of archive you managed to gather because it's so precious. And with Kent State, it was a question of choice. So that was already there. I would say for the contemporary, I wasn't filming the contemporary thinking of it in juxtaposition to the archive. I thought the archive was informing me, but I need to go and film the contemporary because I want to see how these things are remembered, in some ways in abundance at Kent State and in deficit at Jackson State in terms of resources. And at some point, the thing that happened, the switch that happened really for me was the decision to split it back into 3 channels so that archive could sit by itself. So that archive doesn't fulfill that function of first archive, then contemporary, then archive, then contemporary, and also the slaloming between 16:9 and 4:3, which most of us usually solve by blowing up the 4:3. And then sometimes you look at it closely, you'll see like an essential piece of the image is cut because that's what happens when you expand it. Those are all things that anyone who works with archive deals with. I just decided, no, the archive will sit by itself, and it won't do the double duty of following the contemporary, but it will sometimes be on the left and the right at the same time. There are some moments, the first clip that Joshua showed is that where the archive is directly reflecting something in the contemporary. The contemporary is the Kent State student cleaning the markers, and the archive is actually different graves, but graves of students who died in 1971, 71 or 72. Paul Ronder made a film. He's actually the rare filmmaker who visited both Kent and Jackson. He went to Allison's grave and one of the, I think, Philip's grave. So there, the archive is reinforcing, you could say, the contemporary. At other times, the archive is also contradicting what you're seeing in the center screen because there are declarations of how long we will remember and never forget and learn the lessons. And the archive might immediately remind you that actually it didn't work out that way.
Yeah. No, I mean, I think that's so helpful because to me, this is, let's say, a theory of how history operates. And you could read it as that way in that there's simultaneities, there's confluences, there are conjunctures at every given point in time. It's not fixed. I mean, this is why I'm so drawn to your work in moving image, particularly because there is this kind of sense of the sort of fluidity and the flexibility. There are sort of forces at work in our society that want to make things fixed. And in fact, just the process of sorting through the archives, seeing the kind of different grades of film, seeing the kind of differences in how things get remembered is really, really illuminating for how we should approach history. Now, on the idea of history being fixed, I'm really drawn to the aspects of the film that focus on memorials and the act of memorialization. So whether that's something more simple and personal, like a tombstone, a grave is a kind of memorial, but then there are public memorials, state-sponsored memorials. And one of the aspects of the film that you zero in on are the differences in these memorials. So Maya Lin's Vietnam Memorial, the memorial to the victims of communism, they make appearances. And you do these incredible first-person interviews with Vietnamese Americans, people who immigrated to the US from Vietnam, people whose family members did not get that luxury of immigrating to the US. And one of those people is Thuy Dinh, who discusses the sort of representation of Vietnamese in American popular culture, in films in particular, and how some people show up, some Vietnamese people show up in these films, but It's not at all accurate to history. That, many Vietnamese feel that their truth is not being told, so that there are some people who get the sort of luxury of a metaphorical or a symbolic representation, and then there are some people who are not afforded that kind of actual space to tell their stories. And I think your first person interviews with Thuy Dinh, with also some of the alumni of Kent State, which I found very, very moving. So you have members of Students for a Democratic Society, SDS, like Ken Hammond, who is Kent State of 71, who directly tell you about the experience. What was that like, the process of conducting these interviews? And why did you feel that it was important to have that first person's perspective?
I mean, those are the people who, as I said, you have to think about what your ironic tone, how it works with those who have a claim to that history and maybe come repeatedly every year, in the case of Ken and some others to Kent State, also in the case of Jackson Street. So I thought it was very important to not have the God voice from a distance, which you can get from the archive or from your narration, to have to navigate the complexity of talking to people who may not agree with your interpretation of these same events, right? Certainly, I might say Kent State is over-memorialized, Jackson State is under-memorialized, and Hard Hat Riots, which is the third event, is just forgotten. But for the people of Kent State who were actually in that moment, they might say, no, I still want to remember it. The thing to also note is that in terms of people, I interviewed a lot of people, obviously, but the people that ended up being in the film, I would say, were people who are disobedient even to their own expectation of narrative within their space, right? So Ken is actually one of the ones who's quite critical of the way that the Kent State memorials are depoliticized, right? So he actually talks directly about the fact, he's being interviewed. He talks directly about how can you be talking about Vietnam and not talk about what Vietnam was about, which is to stop an American sponsored, American-run war overseas, and we're in that moment again. So he's very direct. So those are the people who ended up making it into the film, those who are a little bit complicated. You mentioned Thuy Dinh. I mean, the film that she talked about, I would say it's almost too easy to critique that film. I mean, I critique that film as well, but it's almost too easy, and I also include it, which is Deer Hunter, because it's the example of American lives always mattering more than any other lives in discourse here in the United States, right? Because Deer Hunter, it comes out in 78, 3 years after the fall of Saigon. It is within that genre of the damaged returnee from Vietnam. The entire story is about the GI who's come back, can't fit into society, and there's schisms. There's a whole series of films like that in that 4 to 5 year period. So even criticism of Vietnam or critical lens on Vietnam is still through the American, right? And then Deer Hunter, of course, does have Vietnamese characters, but presented in this extremely unflattering way, the famous Russian roulette scene, which she's talking about. But Thuy Dinh is interesting because what she represents is the initial criticism. Initially, of course, there was an intense pushback to Deer Hunter, but the Vietnamese American community in 1978 was not substantial in terms of their access to media. So you can imagine that the Vietnamese American community might be upset, but also not have the ability to change the narrative of discourse. I could very imagine that if Deer Hunter had come out now, and it was nominated for the Oscar, it of course won, the Vietnamese American community would have a lot more to say about its position as Oscar nominee and what it says about anti-Asian racism, etc. That wasn't the space of 78, right? So the Vietnamese American community was relegated to this position of complaining among themselves, but not being picked up by the mainstream discourse. But what Thuy does at a distance of 30 plus years is also be able to give some space to that film as doing an interesting experiment she feels now. And then she says, well, for the Vietnamese community, metaphor, because the defense from Michael Cimino and others was that, well, the Russian roulette game was meant to be a metaphor for the American position in Vietnam rather than an actual game that people were playing in Vietnam. And she said, well, metaphor is not something people can absorb when it's so painful and it's so recent. And so that I thought was interesting because within multiple Vietnamese American narratives as well as Vietnamese narratives, she's also a little bit different. She doesn't quite fit, right? She, she talks about contemporary Vietnamese American literature as something very vital. And finally, the voices are coming from our community, but it's also this many years later. But she doesn't directly denounce Deer Hunter. She's still trying to figure it out. And of course, what you see on screen is just a small fragment of a much longer conversation about that film. So I was interested in these people who just don't fit, right? Who themselves might come to these memorials, but might feel uneasy about the memorials being sanitized.
Yeah,
The
exactly.
talking about war, but not talking about the current wars that
Right.
are US sponsored. So those were the people that came out to me through the interviews. And of
Yeah.
course, you have to pick and choose because you're also trying to have no one interviewee become the overwhelming narrator for the film as well. Although Ken comes a little bit because Ken appears 3 times, which is more than some of the other protagonists. And then
Yeah.
Thuy Dinh is a very important voice in the center section.
No, absolutely. And I want to, pick up on what you said about their ambivalence or the complexity of their feelings, because one of the things that, I found really illuminating learning about Kent through that first person perspective was the difference in class composition of the protesters. So there was one, the SDS leaders whose I think dad was the governor or something, or some sort of politician. Like there's working class students, there's students who have like more class privilege, and they're coming together in protest of state violence, and then they're met with state violence. Like it's really interesting to me how also this sort of popular memory of Kent State as a tragedy, and perhaps the sort of popular or iconization of moments of tragedy ends up flattening these kinds of complexity. But that complexity comes through these perspectives. And I want to sort of think about that process of historical distance and historical sort of memory in what you do as an artist. I know, we mentioned in your biography, you worked on a project called Prisoners of Shothik Itihash, which focuses on Bangladesh. And Shothik Itihash translates to correct history.
Meant to be ironic, yes.
Meant to ironically, exactly. But and I think that's important because I also want to, I guess I want to ask, what about correctives to history? Is what the work of a contemporary artist looking back through archives, and it doesn't have to just be an artist, writers, anyone who's kind of engaged with history, is there some sort of obligation to be corrective or reparative in some sort of way? Do you have any relationship to that sort of reparative mode?
I mean, those are 2 very different contexts. One is, Bangladesh, where I'm from and where I grew up, and about which I've made a lot of work, and the United States, where I came as an adult for college. Very different context, very different role of history. In Bangladesh, the debates around the foundational war that created the country still has the power to this date, 55 years later, to have someone win an election. Or it's a key element of the election. Elections are won not necessarily based on, I'm going to give a ration card to every adult over 18, but over my father played this role in 1971. So it's who did what when has a deciding role. I mean, it has some role in the United States as well, but what did Nixon do and what did Spiro Agnew do doesn't decide the fate of the modern Democratic Republican or Democratic Socialist of America party. Socialism certainly is invoked all the time as a bugbear in the United States, but that's primarily performative as a way to other political streams. So the debates are different. I mean, I would say the thing that emerged from this research, at least to stay within this context, is that, sadly, without American lives on the line, you can see a steep drop in anti-war organizing in the United States. We are in that moment right now where the protests on the street are minuscule or non-existent, certainly small in number for what's happening right now. And that's partially because there are not the same number of American lives at stake. And you understand that the deeper you go into the protests against the Vietnam War, yes, the students who are protesting are actually the less vulnerable population, because as long as you're in college, you have the potential to get a deferment. It's those people who are not in college, therefore working class population, who is far more likely to be sent to Vietnam.
Right.
I mean, university isn't a permanent deferment, but it's a temporary deferment. So you could say that actually the students protesting against the Vietnam War are less vulnerable than others. And that's why one of the ironies is the moment where a blue-collar workforce in New York City comes
Right.
face to face with the students are seen as privileged. And you look at it and you go, but the blue-collar worker, or at least their children, or they themselves, are far more likely to be called up to the draft and far less able to seek out some deferment. But this idea of cross-class solidarity, didn't work. It's really easy to break cross-class solidarity, actually. I'm thinking of this film, is it called Behind the Beautiful Now? I can't remember the exact title, but there's a sequence from the 1968, 68 and after moments in France, where there are all these protests, where students are trying to build alliances with workers in France. And it's working for a moment, and then the factory bosses figure out how to break it. And one of the moments is a student outside the factory who is trying to organize, and the factory foreman or whoever starts shouting at him and says, "Have you ever worked in a factory? If you haven't worked in a factory, what are you doing talking here?" So the foreman, who is a boss and who can be in an oppressive role with the workers, still in that moment is saying to the workers, don't listen to the student because he's never even done anything with his hands. And it's a very clever, cunning way to break cross-class solidarity. And you saw this here with the hard hat riots, where blue-collar construction workers were told and received the message that all these student protesters are spoiled, privileged kids. And in that moment, you don't differentiate between who's a scholarship kid and who might be themselves the son or daughter of blue-collar labor. This image that's on the screen on the left is actually one of the students getting beaten up during the hard hat riots. So I wasn't trying to correct that, but I thought I should probe into it. But also, you can only probe into it so much in a film, which is 80 minutes plus, in which you're trying to go through so many vignettes. So you can touch on it, but you're never going to be able to resolve it or even be encyclopedic. A friend of mine is actually just finished a book that's coming out soon that's actually about working class organizing against the war, and he intends that to be a corrective. And he's someone who, after seeing my film, said, but if I saw this, then I would think that blue collar labor was always pro-war, and that's not true either, right? Or that blue collar labor never allied with students. That's not true either. And so I suppose for that more complex story, you need the book, not the film in which it appears for 5-6 minutes in fragments, and with a desire for a narrative flow that I wanted to have.
No, absolutely. Thank you. Thank you so much for that. I mean, again, the complexity of these different sort of moments of protest, I think, is really important. But I want to pick up on the sort of, thread in your work here in Through a Mirror Darkly of the university as this persistent site of struggle. It's not about any specific university, but the idea, as you said, of how the student workers against the war, against this demonstration, but also at Jackson State against anti-Black racism, they're seen as this threat. They're seen as this threat by the state and met with state oppression. And I think so much of what your work highlights here also is this manipulation by popular media, by news channels of, these, feisty kids, they have nothing to do but protest. I think, Nixon has this line where he just totally dismisses these student workers who are actively putting their lives on the line. They're met with the National Guard. I want to kind of think about that with what you just said about the misrecognition by the blue collar workers working on the World Trade Center of these universities. It's the pitting against one another. You said cross-class solidarity is very easy to break. And I think something that your film highlights is the role of the state in actively trying to break that, in the role of popular media, How would you sort of, you know, you were also on the campus, right? In filming this, there's a moment where the film opens with people exiting a screening of a film, and I was wondering if that was on the university campus itself.
That was at Kent State. Yes,
That
that's
was at
the
Kent State, right?
screening of Fire in the Heartland, um,
Mhm.
and they're exiting. I think people are always astonished when students take what they're being taught literally, all of these classes that where they're learning about building a just society. And, the pivot is often that perhaps the lesson that people want to impart is to build the just society, just empower and enhance yourself, get a job above everything
Right,
else.
right.
And there are generations who have said, no, it isn't enough for my own placement. I have to change the society, and my job isn't going to change the society. It isn't enough. And students, of course, take incredible risks. We are very familiar with the specter of students in the last 2 years who have protested in all campuses across the United States, being punished in ways that are going to be crippling for their future careers in this brutal economy. I have also met people from that Vietnam War era. It's not so easily legible because I think the flows of college to workplace are more complicated in the 1970s, but who participated in this protest and paid a heavy price. It's just not visible in the same way. But when you start asking them what they did afterwards, it's clear that they can't arrive somewhere, that they're not being able to find jobs. So it has a tremendous impact. You don't even need to be blacklisted, or maybe they were blacklisted and we don't even know. So it's
Yeah,
always astonishing to people when students are putting, praxis into action and saying, but this is the society. I mean, during Occupy Wall Street, which I was involved in, I remember just realizing that so many people there were students, undergraduate and graduate students, who had left the classroom, gone down to Zuccotti Park because they saw that in practice what they had been debating in class.
right.
Yeah, so the university is always, and then the university is a site of fear. And I think it's
Yes.
partially because of that cross-class solidarity that people also fear that what if the university students then make common cause with workers? It's why, one of the reasons that graduate student unions are often pushed back event or pushback structure, because that is another way of organizing by getting into the union structure. So I came across all the time that the university is often the site of ferment. And I suppose one of the things you understand is Vietnam is transformative for this country and also globally, but certainly for this country, the United States, because state institutions and institutions broadly also took sharp lessons from that moment. The elimination of the
Mhm.
draft is the elimination of what they thought is one of the primary reasons that students might get politicized. The
Right.
rise of certain questions of speech, and the
Mhm.
question of speech being injurious to others is also the rise of a certain kind of methods for monitoring speech by saying that it's, also stepping on other people's spaces. I mean,
Yeah.
pretty obvious from our experiences in recent times. So the university naturally emerges as organizing place, and yet also the university also can be controlled in certain ways, because what is always held above the students is the right to graduate.
Right.
And that's one
Right.
of the things that was, I think, the thing that actually different during the Vietnam War, because popular sentiment had turned so sharply that the students couldn't really be punished in some cases in a comprehensive way. The people who were arrested as the Kent State, I forget the exact number, but a number of Kent State students were arrested and accused of fomenting a situation such that the National Guard had no choice but to fire. They were eventually all let go because popular sentiment was on the side of the students.
Yeah.
And the administration was less successful in deploying the media against the students. That's also the zeitgeist of that time.
Mhm.
I should say one other thing which we shouldn't lose sight of, which is the demographic of the US university today is
Right.
dramatically different from 1970. There's a much larger uh, population, hyphenated American or new arrivals, can be both. It all is often mixed together. That is easier to otherize.
Right.
Islamophobia or anti-Arab racism or anti-Black racism are some of the elements that are deployed, but those are not the only ones. Whereas in 1970, perhaps what would be needed to other the students is either focus on the Black students,
Mhm.
um, or focus on communist influence. There's a moment in the film where if you follow Weather Underground history, you actually recognize at least one person in there who later leaves SDS and joins the Weather Underground. But they're being asked if there are communists in their midst, and they make a joke about it. But you understand that if they had said yes, that's damaging in that moment.
Right.
But different levers of othering have been found now.
Yeah, absolutely. And I want to add about the kind of downstream effects of the Vietnam War on the university campus. So even though there is no draft, given the exorbitant costs of university tuition and everything, if you sign up for a federal loan, which, unless you're exorbitantly wealthy, you need one to attend college, you are required to register for the selective service. So it is tied to these very events in the 1970s. I mean, I am here at Berkeley, on the Berkeley campus. So yes, speaking of memorialization, there is the Free Speech Cafe for the free speech movement in 1964-69. But then the way that the Black Panthers were so crucial to a lot of student protest here on the Berkeley campus in 68 to 69. I mean, the memorialization of that, there's a huge difference. I want to add, now sort of in the few remaining moments, a little bit of a discussion of the overall installation of Corinthians at the WEX, where you've brought together different works from the WEX collection, as well as some select loans. Can you talk a little bit about how these works, so there are works by artists such as Saul Steinberg, you have Robert Smithson's documentation of a partially buried woodshed. There's a lot of other works in here, both from the collection and kind of responding to some of the gaps in the collection that were just a part of the collecting process. How did you kind of think about the entire experience of the exhibition with these works?
So originally we had proposed only to select works from the WEX's collection. We wanted to stay within that geographic remit and that location remit of let's see what the WEX collected, because they were very early to a lot of collecting. They actually have Chris Burden's famous video made when he's dragging himself over the sea of glass or the bed of glass. Those glass fragments are actually in the WEX's collection. So you can understand they actually went a bit wide, more than you'd expect an Ohio institution to be. But then, of course, there are very big gaps, right? The number of women artists in the collection is very small. You see here Martha Rosler. We had to go outside the collection to get that. It's a personal loan from Martha, whom I know from here in New York, actually. The collection definitely reflects important works made in response to the Vietnam War at the time, but it has all the usual expected blind spots. And at a certain point, we actually thought, rather than trying to correct it fully, we would actually have wall text that says the collection reflects the biases and blind spots of that time. So then it becomes an opportunity for Ohio State University students to talk about why certain works are not there, right? So the number of artists of color or women artists in the collection are small, which the curators themselves would say. So that's how the collection came about. Obviously, or not obviously perhaps, but the one work that still has a visual, visceral impact is the famous "And Babies" piece, which is the image from My Lai with the questions being asked during the investigation, where they say, they're explaining why they're shooting, why they were shooting. And the question, and they're saying we had to shoot everything. And then the questioner says, "And babies?" ? And the answer is "And babies." It's a famous moment from the My Lai investigation. That's maybe the only graphically violent piece in there that we had to have a disclaimer for, and to some degree, maybe the Martha Rosler pieces as well. So one of the enervatingly sad things of that moment was also understanding that what woke human conscience in 1970, United States or globally, wouldn't have an impact now. I mean, it's really, it's a stunning moment of silence when you look at the My Lai photographs and realize that brutal and graphic as they were, we see images far more graphic than that coming out of, Iran, Palestine, or Ukraine, or wherever else there's a war going on right now with US involvement or otherwise. Images don't shock people in the same way. And that's very worrying for anyone who works with
Right.
images and believes in the power of your work to change things, or at least start conversation, right? A numbness to images is quite worrying for future work or future work of, I'm losing my way with what I'm trying to say here because this is so complicated set of things I'm thinking in my mind. But there is a way that, you look at the Mila images and go, oh my God, if that happened today, nothing would happen.
Right. But I mean that's the sort of task that, people who work with images, people who work with archives history, they have to, to quote Beckett, find the form that accommodates the mess. You have to find the ways in which, that you do pierce through all of the bullshit propaganda. You have to pierce through all of this. I mean, I think to me, this is one of the reasons why your film is so effective, because you see the differences in the actual media itself. I think there's a sort of difference in not only the quality but the pacing. It feels like a live wire to watch some of those archival clips and think about what was really at stake, not, for the students, for the protesters, but for the person filming it too. And I think, to me, when I still see videos and images from Palestine and Iran and Ukraine and elsewhere, I still kind of, I think about that kind of distancing effect, and yet that, being on the ground there is still, how do we make sense of that? How do we convey that? I know that we are kind of coming to time, so I do want to allow for Q&A and for anyone to open up any questions or discussions or points that they might have with our discussion here.
Thank you so much, Tausif and Naeem, for that conversation. Before we go ahead and open it up to questions from the audience, I'm going to try one more time to pull up that second video clip here real quickly. If that's all right with you both. Can you see this?
Yes.
Okay, here we go.
Because they fight, they send soldiers to fight in Vietnam. It's not by the Congress, but by the presidents themselves for the cause of re-election. So that's why I call re-election war.
50 years is not long enough for people to kind of have a distancing, to see the war or judge their memory on a more critical or more distancing view. It's still fairly literal.
Alrighty. Now we're going to go ahead and open it up to questions from the audience. If you are in the audience and have a question for Naeem, there is a link in the chat where you can submit that. But to kick us off, our first question is gonna come from Chloe in the audience. There you go, Chloe.
That's me. I'm going to ask the first question. Thank you so much, Naeem and Tausif. That was absolutely fantastic. And I really, really enjoyed listening. My question is, I'm struck by what you said, Naeem, about including the interviews in this piece and balancing them to ensure that no one person emerged as the narrator. And sorry, one moment. There we go. That balance feels essential to the work's cacophony of fragments, and maybe how it counters other ways of preserving a history or an archive and resists a singular perspective. And I wonder if you can talk about fragments and how you developed that practice in the video works, and if there are other instances where you've maybe visually or otherwise avoided a singular perspective in order to make room for that cacophony and collective.
Yeah, I mean, I think you realize when you're interviewing people that they might even disagree with each other, that all the people within a certain memorial site may even not see each other as naturally speaking the same thing, and yet they're both or multiples are in your film. And wasn't without bumps, when you're trying to figure out something and you tell someone, the typical experience is you tell someone, oh, I just met such and such, and instead of a reaction of that's great, there's silence, and you go, oh, did I step on some old, and you probably have, right? Which is one of the reasons why the Kent State Archive is split between two universities. And then you're trying to have them both be there and have to be fair to their presence while also trying to reconcile this contradiction of having them be in the same plane. And so the fragments come out of that. I think in the past, maybe I gave myself different kinds of licenses when it was parts of Bangladesh history. I have this film, Afsan's Long Day from 2014, where the way that I use fragments is that you never know who's speaking. So sometimes it's the historian's diary, sometimes it's actually from a different philosopher and their ideological opposites, and it's all narrated in the first person in my voice. So that's the unifying element. But at some point you also understand it can't be the same person, because at some point my narration is talking about Germany 1977. So you understand it couldn't be the same. By now I don't use that method anymore. I actually really don't have myself as a narrator in the films anymore. It feels like something I could do 10 years ago. Now I'm skeptical about my own voice in films now.
Thank you for that answer.
Our next question from the audience is, how have you been surprised by any responses from interviewees to your film when it's been shown?
I think from some Kent State alumni, there is some hesitation about the film, possibly. They understand the need to decenter Kent State and to center Jackson State in a particular way. If you phrase it like that, they would completely say, yes, that's what should be done. But in practice, it can be a little discombobulating because after all, the events of May 4th, 1970 is a very defining element for a part of the alumni. It's one of the most significant events that happens every year. So to see that decentered while it's going on in the voice of Ken Hammond primarily, who is critical of the memorial, I think has been discombobulating for some people, but people aren't also going to say, oh, you shouldn't show this or something. There's just there's a quiet after you've shown it, which may also mean they're processing it, but there isn't but also it's naive to think, oh, everybody's going to be enthusiastic when you're trying to complicate the narrative. And there was a certain narrative that dominated for so long. I also will say one other thing, that it hasn't shown widely in the US yet, right? In London, when it showed, that's a very different response. And I think in Britain, sometimes it's rather easy to see some of these things as an American problem, which, as I was saying to someone, but you've got Nigel Farage about within stone's throw of becoming prime minister of this country. So it isn't, rising ethno-nationalism isn't limited to one country, but there can be a way of looking at it as an uniquely American problem. So there's a distance. Here in the US, the first campus it's being shown now is Ohio State right now. So it hasn't shown at Kent State yet, for example.
Thank you so much for that answer. Our next question is about whether your practice has always involved archival research.
Yes, although I didn't use that word. I was just, here's what I think the first archival material I ever worked with was my father's photographs. And I think there was also an early encounter of how to make work from an archive that's mostly empty. Most of his photographs that he took over a 30-year period are gone. There was only one box of negatives that survived. So it was a very early encounter of, all these things are out there, but they're not out there. This is all there is. There isn't a hidden box somewhere. It's not gone to the Yale archives or some university archives isn't suddenly going to pop up with my father's negatives. So then, I don't know, there was a clarity from knowing there's nothing else, that this is all there is. You don't get blocked because there's so little. It's like either make work from this one negative strip, and if your father happened to have just taken pictures of cats that year, figure out what you're going to do with an archive of cats of 1953. It was, I think, my first encounter also with an archive that didn't have important photographs. I asked my father why he hadn't left the house to take photographs of the streets, because that would be the streets of what's today Bangladesh, was then East Pakistan of 1953. And he was like, why would I go out onto the streets? It was a time of photography of a certain salon style. So limitations were imposed on me very early, and that is my relationship with archive. And actually, Through a Mirror Darkly is a strange project because there is so much material about the Vietnam War. So it's like a different kind of, it's not what I'm used to, actually.
Thank you again for that answer. Our last question in the audience Q&A comes from someone in the audience who writes, can you speak more to the values of the format of the 3-channel video?
It's a very good question because I think about it all the time. I've only made 2 3-channel films. This is the second one, and the first one was in 2017. So almost 8 years ago, which was 2 Meetings and a Funeral. In both cases, I think it was chosen in order to not have contemporary and archive be in sequence. And it was also chosen for a contrast that you see in real time, where you hear the speech or you see the speech, but meanwhile, the archive is unraveling the speech. In this case, Through a Mirror Darkly, actually, 2 archival footages are sometimes at war with each other. The memorial site sometimes doesn't undo the archive because the memorial site of Jackson State, for example, of 2024, doesn't contradict whatever a news reporter said in 1970. But what the news reporter said in 1970 and what somebody else said at the same time at a different venue, they can undo each other. So it really has been about, I will say, ironic juxtaposition and undoing people with their own words or undoing people with what's happening at the same time. Richard Nixon says, we have handled the problem. And you see in the other screen all the evidence of the problem not being, quote unquote, handled at all. I also haven't made more than 2 because I've found this format to lead to the work circulating much more in North America and Europe, and much less in the global South, just in terms of resource allocation. So, if you work in a format that doesn't circulate widely, that's kind of a problem. So this is the first time I've come back to that format in spite of that limitation.
Thank you so much, Naeem. That concludes our audience Q&A. And so I'm going to pass the virtual mic over to you, Naeem, to share a reading.
Yes. It's a very short one. It's 4 lines. I was looking at these this collection of poems that were published in the anniversary of the Kent State killings. And as I was saying to Joshua, I was trying to find something that wouldn't be, I don't know, somehow dissonant with our time. So I think, if I'm not misreading it, these are actually by Herman Melville reprinted in a magazine on the anniversary of Kent State. So to reach back for something at this moment is interesting. This is just 4 lines. It's an excerpt from The Armies of the Wilderness. Dust to dust and blood for blood, passion and pangs, has time gone back? Or is this the age of the world's great prime?
Thank you for sharing that with us. And thank you, Tausif, and again, Naeem, for this conversation. Thank you, Julia from the Wexner Center for the Arts, for their support in preparing for today's event. We'd also like to thank the Marion Bolton Kippy Stroud Foundation and Tiger Foundation for sponsoring our NSE program and making these weekday conversations possible, and for their support of our growing archive, which you can view on the Rails YouTube channel. The Rail has been free and independent for 25 years. A donation directly supports our writers, production staff, and operations. You can support our work through the link in the chat. And if you're available, join us tomorrow at 1 p.m. for a conversation with Karina Aguilera-Skaversky, Gianfranco Foschino, Annalise Wolf, Dan Cameron, and Rodrigo Rojas on the story and work of La Capilla Azul, an independent curatorial platform in Chile. And as Israel tradition, we now invite you to say hello and goodbye as you leave today. Thanks so much, Tausif and Naeem.
Yeah.
Thank you so much, everyone.
Thank you
Naeem.
so
Thank you,
much.
Tausif.
Thank you all so much.
So much.
Thank you.
Good to see you, Tausif.
Thank
Good
you,
to see you.
everybody.
Bye.
Bye, everyone.
Bye-bye.